and I'm a co-chair to the Asian Faculty Staff Network Affinity Group. And as you all know, this month of May is the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, where we recognize the contributions and the influence to the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. So we have an exciting program today. And now it is an honor to have our president, Dr. Lynette Zelezny, join us today to offer words of support and encouragement. President Zelezny, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all. It's truly an honor to join you to recognize and celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month and to learn from our distinguished speaker, Anne Kaneko. I value and appreciate events like this because we are able to highlight and celebrate our diversity and inclusion here at Cal State Bakersfield. I want to thank the Asian Faculty and Staff Network for the vital work they do to help make CSUB a place of respect and inclusion. The network deserves our gratitude for serving as such an important resource and source of support for our Asian and Asian American faculty and staff, our students, and our entire community. I'm particularly thankful for their efforts in bringing such an important voice to our ongoing conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a thank you, a gratitude to Anne Kaneko for taking the time to share your important insights with our community. Through her award-winning work, she is making sure that the voices of the Asian community are heard and treated with respect they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, President Zelezny. And now let me introduce Dr. Jorge Moraga. He is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies and ethnic studies here at CSUB. And he will provide more information about today's talk. Dr. Moraga?
Mil gracias, Pierre, and in Lakesh to everyone. Hello and welcome, and happy Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Dr. Jorge Moraga. My pronouns are he, him, él, and I acknowledge that I am living, working, and pursuing life on the land of the Yokuts, native protectors and people of what is now called Bakersfield. As an event sponsored by California State University Bakersfield, CSUB acknowledges with gratitude the beauty of the land of the Kitanamu people of the Tejon tribe. As a non-Asian, non-Pacific Islander person of color, it is my distinct honor to be invited by the Asian Faculty and Staff Network to introduce this wonderful event and our guest speaker today. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1978, a joint congressional resolution established Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. The first 10 days of May were chosen to coincide with two important milestones in Asian Pacific American history. One, the arrival in the United States of the first Japanese immigrants on May 7, 1843, and two, contributions of Chinese workers to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad completed on May 10, 1869. 14 years later, Congress expanded the week-long observance to a month-long celebration, now known as Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Among the many reasons we must celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month are: one, to continue fighting against assimilation and cultural erasure, acknowledging the rich diversity of the Asia and Pacific diaspora; two, to preserve cultural memory and relearn the stories of Asian American, and Pacific Islander Native communities; three, to move beyond racial dichotomies embedded in the white-black binary and also claim place in the struggle for racial justice and movement solidarities; and four, to acknowledge the massive contributions and talents of Asian American and Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian communities to not just this settler democracy called the United States, but across the world. Indeed, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month is an opportunity for everyone across color lines to listen, reflect, understand, and act. Now, in a moment of revitalized anti-Asian discrimination and violence in the U.S., it is important to consider what Asian American author and intersectional feminist Grace Lee Boggs left us with: the urgency to, quote, create more human beings and more democratic institutions, end quote. One person who has taken this lesson to heart is Anne Kaneko, who today will share excerpts from her many films to illustrate how rancor has been directed at different communities and the need to better understand global shades of targeting difference. Ms. Anne Kaneko is an award-winning LA-based independent filmmaker. Her work is attentive to the ways that power influences the personal, where she explores themes such as subject and group identity formation, histories of exclusion and containment, labor economy and global migration patterns, and the interconnections between ecology, colonialism, and community belonging. Among some of Anne Kaneko's films are A Flicker in Eternity, 100% Human Hair, Overstay, and most recently, the documentary Manzanar Diverted, Where Water Becomes Dust. An MFA in film directing graduate of UCLA's School of Theater, Film, and Television, Anne Kaneko's films have been featured at the Getty Center, Red Cat, and the Highways Performance Space. Kaneko's talents and artistry has also been commissioned to produce media installations for the National Endowment for the Arts, the California Endowment, and the Skirball Cultural Center. On top of all this, she is also a Fulbright and a Japan Foundation Artist Fellow. Currently, Anne Kaneko teaches media studies at Pitzer College and serves as artist mentor for Visual Communications Onto the Camera Fellowship, a program for emerging Asian Pacific filmmakers. Please extend your nonverbal cues and your emoji cons to help me welcome award-winning filmmaker and artist Anne Kaneko.
Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here, here with you remotely at Cal State University of Bakersfield, a little bit away. I just wanted to acknowledge that I am zooming in from Chumash, Tongva primarily, and Chumash unceded lands, and also known as Los Angeles. I'm here in my home, and I have an orange wall behind me. I'm wearing a huipil from Mexico, very colorful with flowers, and I have short black hair for those of you who may be vision impaired. So anyway, it's a real honor to be here with all of you today. It's an opportunity for me to share a few clips of my work, to sort of think about where we are in this moment. You know, this has been a year not to be forgotten for many reasons. And I think that, part of this year, in terms of social justice, race issues, and added to that mix right now are sort of the backlash against Asian American communities in terms of hate crimes. I mean, really sort of a response, I guess, to COVID. But so in this moment, I just wanted to kind of share with you some different clips from some of my work, and sort of some of my thoughts, how, I feel it's been interesting to sort of be able to look at all of these different moments in my past, but also to think about how this has been a part of my work, but also how we might think about this going forward. This notion of difference, I think, is really a part of ethnic studies. It's a part of really who I am, having grown up here in the United States. This notion of identity and this construction of identity. And I think all of my films have really kind of grappled with those issues. And so today I really wanted to kind of focus on this notion of difference and how difference has been targeted. It's really kind of been, I think from a personal perspective, I've always grappled with this. And it's really kind of those personal experiences that, maybe color and really influence the direction in our lives that we take. I personally grew up in an African-American community. And so I was one of maybe a handful of kids who weren't African-American. And so I was always asked this question of that I was different. And so this is, I think, impacted kind of maybe my interests. And then, after I went to elementary school, I moved to another suburban area of Southern California in the Inland Empire. And, and that community was primarily white and Latinx. And so, again, I was different. I felt different because I looked different. But I knew that there was much more to that. And so I think that, my films have been an attempt to sort of understand what that meant and really look at it beyond just these kind of isms that are attached to us or beyond just race, gender, class, sort of this complex of identity that are thrust upon us. So I wanted to first start with a clip from, I'm going to go kind of chronologically, and I'm going to start with my first documentary. Actually, I made it while I was in graduate school at UCLA, and it looks at immigration in the context of Japan. It looks at undocumented workers there, and this was in the 90s. And so it looks at, here, I have a little PowerPoint, so I'll share an image with you from that. But this film is called, so here, I'll just step through this. So here's my talk. These are kind of some of the issues that I think a lot of my work looks at. There's social justice, global community, cross-cultural identity, history, immigration, memory, colonialism. I feel like Tagalog was fairly easy to navigate since there's so much Spanish in it. And, for the Urdu also had a fair amount of English in it. So anyway, that was kind of an interesting experience. And here are the subjects in the film. I'm just going to show you a short clip that really looks at sort of targeting. And so maybe we can look at the first clip from Overstay.
And you can share your video or the videos, or do you want me to bring that?
Oh, yeah, I didn't have that queued up. If you could share that, that would be helpful. I thought we both had screen sharing possibility. I apologize.
Okay, yeah, I can queue that up.
Okay.
Con una extranjera que después acabó conmigo en un hotel. Porque ellos no dicen, con la filipina o con la china o con la coreana no fue el hotel, o con la mexicana o con la peruana. Ellos dicen la chin, dicen, todos somos iguales para ellos, ¿no?
लोग नहीं people पाकिस्तानी ईरानी और दूसरे लोग आए हुए वो कुछ जाने कार्ड पिन बनाने के लिए हम लोग वही तरीका इस्तेमाल करते हैं बात करना
このお店があって物を約束した場所をもう決最初からここになったから友達を会いにここに来ましたで5000人の人の中で10人とか20人ぐらい いろいろ返上変わるとか、いけないこともしてたかもしれない。でも日本のマスコミは、どうしてここに集まると、本当は話してくれなくて、悪いことばっかりするとイメージをつけた。
जहाँ जाते हैं लोग देख लेते हैं पूछते हैं तेरे पास पासपोर्ट है वीजा है बहुत से लोग ऐसे भी आए जिनसे पैसा लगा कर आते हैं कर्जा लेकर आते हैं 4-5 लाख रुपए में आते हैं जापान उसके बाद ही पकड़ के उसको महीना भी नहीं होता पकड़ के भेज देते हैं उसको वापस तो वो बस क्यों है आखिर इनर भी नहीं बरत सकते आखिर ये भी इंसान है ये इंसान है दबाने का फर्क है
どうしてもやっぱり外人さんの目的っていうのは悪いことしないでお金を本国へお金を送金したいんだ。だからそれだけのことだからポリスは知っててもそれを暗黙見て見ぬふりしてると。よっぽど悪いことをしない限りはわざわざ強制送還しろということまではまだ言ってません。で法務省からまたそういう指令も出てないから動かないんじゃないかなと私は思います。仮にこれ日本の警察の上の人たちとかあと法務省が不法滞在者を全部一掃しろとそういう命令が出れば警察も動くと思います。
Thanks. So this film, Overstay, I think for me was really a way to look and think about immigration, and it allowed me to kind of maybe experience some of the things that my grandparents had experienced. I'm third generation, so my grandparents immigrated from Japan, and when I was living in Japan, I was so curious to realize that Japan had become a host country itself. So this became sort of an opportunity for me to think about what that experience was, and so it became very clear to me that the immigrant experience, I think, in being sort of othered and being different, was very there were many common themes and common aspects to what that was, regardless of the host country or the country of origin of the people who were immigrating. It's interesting because I really felt like I had a sort of camaraderie with the folks who are featured in the film, since they kind of understood that my grandparents had also left Japan. And although I was Japanese American, they saw me as being very similar to the Japanese Brazilians and Peruvians who they worked side by side with. So anyway, but moving on, I think, I mean, clearly, I think you can kind of see these issues of being othered and sort of being targeted as very similar. So the next clip I want to show you is from, let me pull up my little PowerPoint again. So the next film is a film that I shot in Peru. It's called Against the Grain, an Artist's Survival Guide to Peru. And this was kind of an exploration. I was very curious, having met many Japanese Peruvians. I was so curious about this country, which had elected a Japanese Peruvian president, Alberto Fujimori. And so this film really began as this exploration of looking at that community. But then in the time that I applied for the Fulbright, and by the time I got to Peru, he had fled the country and was in exile in Japan, kind of a persona non grata in Peru. But this became really an exploration more of sort of artists' responsibilities. And again, I think about identity. There was Claudio, who was an immigrant kind of internally from Peru, from Ayacucho, who had left where he, because of the violence in South and in Ayacucho, this is where the Sendero Luminoso was very strong. He had come to Lima. Alfredo had been imprisoned for sort of his work with in kind of the underground punk scene, sort of suspected as a terrorist, although his artwork was critiquing what was going on. And then of course there was Eduardo, who was Okinawan Peruvian or Japanese Peruvian, who I shared a lot of issues and commonalities with, but he, I think, definitely felt targeted with the president who was not so popular. So we'll see some clips around that. And then the last other character that I focused on was Natalia, who was sort of interested in these feminism and class issues. So, but I think that all of these artists sort of reflected different parts of who I was, and I could relate to them in different ways. So, I'm only showing you a short clip here, but I just wanted to give you the kind of overview of the film, or the panorama of the film. So if we could look at the next clip from this film, Against the Grain, it's the second clip. There's no audio. Can we start it again so we can hear it from the beginning?
And frustrations at crooked politicians.
Señorita, quitarle todo eso sin vergüenza.
Todo porquería. Pero el que más odio es la vieja de acá. Acá me quedé de acá. Toda esta gente inmunda, gente de rateros, ladrones, traicioneros a la patria, eso me merece vivir.
Even though I was an outsider, I wasn't immune to Peru's conflicts. One day, I was surprised to find that I had become a target for outrage aimed at Fujimori.
Quiero mandar un mensaje a los japoneses. Pero yo no soy de Japón, entonces... No, está bien. Es que Fujimori ha demostrado lo que realmente son los japoneses. Son unos miserables ladrones, oportunistas e imperialistas. Nosotros vamos a sacar a los japoneses de acá, de nuestra patria.
Alguien te dice, oye, ¿por qué no te vas a tu país? Entonces, quizás es un elemento clave para uno, ¿no? Porque uno dice, ¿a dónde? ¿No? Ya, está bien, me voy a ir a mi país, pero ¿dónde queda? En el Japón, no sé ni si, no podría sobrevivir, media hora en un sitio en donde no sé el idioma y realmente no me ata nada. Estas banderas aparecen siempre cuando he tenido serios problemas en mi concepción de identidad. Es cuando han aparecido estas banderas llenas de comentarios y de cosas, pero es justamente en esos momentos cuando mi sentido de pertenencia, es decir, yo pertenezco al Perú, soy peruano, pero de repente por unas cuestiones simplemente exteriores o físicas, de repente no lo parezca, o este tipo de cosas, es como una especie de manifiesto público, para no tener que explicar a mucha gente, sobre en dónde estoy, hacia dónde voy, qué es lo que quiero, ¿no?
Many of Eduardo's conflicts are borne out by his upbringing.
Años después, estudió mi hermano, mi padre, mi abuelo, la típica bodega de Chemelji. Yo provengo de una familia que está dedicada desde su llegada aquí a Perú a la venta de bodegas, de panadería, de tiendas de ropa. Entonces, siempre han tenido esta idea, esa visión mercantilista de la vida, ¿no? A una persona que durante toda su vida ha trabajado en una bodega y que tiene esta cosa de la vida diaria, la vida cotidiana y lo duro que puede ser, de repente viene un hijo y les dice, miren, voy a dedicarme a la pintura. Yo creo que fue duro para ellos, pero bueno, pues respetaron.
Eduardo's parents came for a visit while I was filming at his house.
最初は心配でした。これで、なんていうか、生計を立てていくのは難しいんじゃないかと思っていましたけどね。
Eduardo's professional identity crisis was compounded by language.
La última obra. Dice con unos padres que hablan japonés. Y yo no hablo japonés. Padres alzaban la famosa muralla del idioma cuando querían hablar de algo importante, ¿no? O algo serio. Entonces hablaban entre ellos japonés y yo estaba en medio y no entendía absolutamente nada y solamente les veía las caras de preocupados si es que había algún problema financiero. Entonces te das cuenta que te pasas un tercio de tu vida tratando de entender qué dice. Entonces realmente eso te crea un hueco, ¿no? Que tratas de llenarlo con un idioma mucho más universal, quizá, ¿no? Por eso es que yo pienso que a veces uno busca un idioma visual, universal, que no necesite traducción, y de repente uno por venganza dice, voy.
So anyway, I think you can sort of see the parallels of what it means to be othered and targeted in this context as well. I think that, this story I feel like we're reliving it right now since Keiko Fujimori, Alberto Fujimori's daughter, is up for running in the runoff very soon in Peru. So his presence in the country, even though he is imprisoned now for civil, for human rights violations, his daughter is still in the mix politically. So anyway, I feel like that has been really interesting and important for me to think about what identity and what these issues mean beyond sort of the borders of our own country. So the next piece that I want to kind of bring here, let me show this to you. The next piece is a piece from, sorry, I have to start over. It's a piece from A Flicker in Eternity, which is a short film that I made. It's 25 minutes, based on the diary of Stanley Hayami, who was from San Gabriel, California. Like Bakersfield, there was a fairly large Japanese American community that was involved. His family actually owned a nursery, not a farm. I know Bakersfield had a lot of Japanese Americans who were working in truck farming before the war. But he was, as many of you I'm sure know, Japanese Americans were rounded up and incarcerated during the war. And so this film is somewhat unique in that it is based on his diary. So you get real insights into a 15-year-old's perspective of what was going on at that time and how he felt in this context of what was happening all around the world, and and how the Japanese American community at that time was very clearly being targeted for being different and for having some political and economic clout at that time. Not so much political, but certainly some economic clout. I think that was probably a lot of the motivation for really pushing Japanese Americans away from the coast, since they were so dominant in the agricultural industry as well as in fishing. And so this became, this is just a little taste of what this particular 15-year-old was feeling at that time. So anyway, if we could share that next clip, I'll stop sharing here.
November 29th, 1942. Today, I am writing my first entry in this journal. It is no special day, but I have to start someplace.
My brother Stanley was only 16 when he began writing and drawing in this diary. We knew the moment we found it that it was something very special. He kept it during World War II when our world was falling apart.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. President Roosevelt has just announced.
Overnight, even though many of us were American citizens, people considered us the enemy. By February, the government declared the West Coast a military zone. We ended up being sent to one of 10 concentration camps spread throughout the country.
I shall remember that day I was evacuated for the rest of my life. As our bus went down the street, a lump came into my throat. be in Hart Mountain, Wyoming.
When our family got to Hart Mountain, all we could see for miles were those tar-papered shacks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. It was a scary time for all of us.
Many people have written about the evacuation and have debates about it in heated discussions. First of all, do I think it was constitutional? No, I do not. We did not go through the due processes of law. They didn't have any evidence. Do I think racial prejudice was involved? Yes, I do. The whole mess was unnecessary and a whole lot of trouble could have been avoided. I personally will try to become a greater man for having gone through such experiences, keep my faith in America, and look forward to the future. Lately, I've heard some people outside even want to take our citizenship away. Maybe I'll just have to sneak off to some island and start my own country.
We had come a long way from our home in San Gabriel, just east of Los Angeles. Ma and Pa ran a small nursery, and all of us kids would help out. I was Stan's only sister, Sach. Besides me, there was our eldest brother, Frank, and our youngest brother, Walt. Stan and I were close, especially when it came to talking about books. Back home, we lived in a comfortable house with 4 bedrooms. But in camp, all 6 of us had to live in one cramped little room.
Doggone it, our room is so noisy that I can't study. Oh, well, I should cram. I'll have to devise a means so I can concentrate better.
I hated camp, and I wanted to leave for college as soon as I could. But my little brother Stan was still in high school, so he had to make the best of things. It was hard for him, but he kept busy by drawing and working on the yearbook. Voluntary enlistment turned out to be a failure, and in January, the government made a surprising announcement.
Selective service was just opened up to Nissan, and recently I turned 18. Draft age. I received a draft questionnaire and was told that if I didn't return it by a certain date, I could go to jail.
Stan spoke with our cousin Paul, who was one of the leaders of the Hart Mountain Fair Play Committee. Paul didn't think I should fight for our country as long as our families were held in camp. Stan kind of agreed with him, but felt there were 2 sides. Paul's side and those that obeyed the draft. Stan chose to obey. Even as Stanley faced being drafted, he was still thinking hard about his life's work.
My heart tells me to be an artist-writer, but I lack confidence. Michelangelo and Leonardo, they were geniuses. I'm not. My mind tells me to be something practical, like an architect. I made up my mind. I'm going into the artist-writer field, and I'm going to be the best artist in the world. So the world better watch out. Hayami is going to the top. Yes, I passed the Army physical. I'm not going to enjoy this war business, because I don't think killing other people is right, and I'm not sure what I'm fighting for. But the way I see it, It isn't up to us to decide whether we go into the Army or not. If Uncle Sam says come, you go.
Frank had already been drafted when Stan got his notice. Stan reported to Colorado to be inducted. Even if he was worried, he always managed to keep his spirits high in his letters to me.
Dear Sach, I'm still here waiting for my call. These are the things I've been doing to make time go by. I wake up nice and early and go brush my teeth. Then for breakfast, and I'm off to a wide-awake start. Then I amble over to the camp. By this time, I feel pretty good, so I go weightlifting. Here you catch a glimpse of my terrific lifting. Then I go eat again. P.S. Did you get my silly graduation picture?
Hopefully you can relate to another young person. So, it's funny because that film, I as a third generation Japanese American, I feel like it's almost expected that I sort of explore this history in some way, and I've kind of resisted it all of my life. But I guess I always found that, there have been so many really amazing films about this experience, but I found through Stanley, I could kind of tell it in a different way through this first person narrative. But I think going forward, I was really interested in finding more complexity to that story and really understanding how this legacy of what had happened to my parents and my grandparents was common and intersected with other communities, right? And so a friend had approached me to make this film or to do some research around Manzanar. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say about Manzanar? Manzanar, especially, there have been so many really kind of amazing films made about it. And so I was interested in really looking at Native American connections, sort of this shared experience of forced removal with the Japanese American community, and also the land. So this next film that I'm going to show you, it's called Manzanar Diverted When Water Becomes Dust, is a film I just completed and just premiered. It's actually going to be screening as the centerpiece film at CamFest, March 16th, Sunday. So put it on your calendars. You can watch a Q&A about it afterwards, as well as the Milwaukee Film Festival. It's going to be streaming there. But this film really, as I was thinking about Manzanar and as I learned more about Manzanar, I was really struck by the fact that this is also Los Angeles's watershed, right? The Payahunadu, or the Owens Valley, is the watershed of Los Angeles and has been, because of the LA Aqueduct, there's been a very violent history. I'm sure many of you are aware of Chinatown, right? And sort of the water wars that had happened earlier in the 19th or 20th century, or actually early 20th century. But Mulholland and all the rest, right? But so I didn't really realize that Manzanar was the site of all of these histories, that it was the history of this violent forced removal of the indigenous people from that place, of the story of ranchers and farmers who had settled it, settler colonials who had settled that place, and that had also been bought out by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in order to make this LA's watershed. And then, ironically, because it was public land, this is where Los Angeles residents, Japanese Americans, were brought to be imprisoned, right, during World War II. And so they kind of transformed this place in that moment. So I just want to show you a clip from this film. And again, it sort of allows us to think about these parallel histories, some of the consequences of being othered, and this difference really in the service of those who are in power, right? And who, I think racism, all of these things, it's because it's in the service of somebody that difference makes, is used in order to, take advantage of people. So I'm going to share this last piece. Hang on. Let's see. With me.
Outsiders came into this valley and renamed it. We called it Payahunadu, which means the place where the water always flows. The Indian people used the creek to irrigate the land and grow the natural vegetation. When the outsiders came, they brought in herds of cattle and they trampled all the tribal people's food supplies. So there was conflict. And then when they were hungry, the Indian people would kill a cow. And then they would come and kill Indians for killing cows. They took all the Indians and tried to get us out of the valley, marched us down by Fort Tejon, and we made our way back, most of us. My great-grandmother made it back by herself as a little girl. I always think about that, how important this place was to her. They talk about history in this valley started when outsiders came in. So the native people of this valley are pushed aside, ignored, not listened to. And that's been the case all along. This is our home. This has been our home. And we have that tie to this place. And we want to protect that right and the importance of this place to my people.
Mr. Chairman and Honorable Commissioners, my name is Sue Kunitomi Embry. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I was evacuated from Los Angeles on May 9, 1942, along with my widowed mother and 6 brothers and sisters. We were sent to the Manzanar concentration camp. I lived in Manzanar for 17 months. The period I spent in Manzanar was the most traumatic experience of my life. It has influenced my perspective as well as my continuing efforts to educate, persuade, and encourage others of my generation to speak out about the unspeakable crime.
When I graduated from high school and decided I was going to come out to Southern California here for college, a big reason was because my grandmother lived here.
I had studied American history and had gone to public school in Los Angeles, and I truly believed that I was American. I think I sort of gave up the idealistic idea of democracy to a more realistic one.
I was coming and taking the train in from Claremont to LA every weekend to see her as she got sicker and sicker, and I started studying more about health and environmental pollution, and started thinking about connections between the air pollution here in Los Angeles and the cough that my grandmother had for as long as I could remember. And so thinking about my grandmother's passing actually helped motivate me to start organizing for environmental justice.
So I think those are, I know there's just a few more minutes, but I just wanted to make some time if there were any questions. I feel like this last film really is more of a exploration of kind of these intersectional issues around social justice and environment. So anyway, but is this going to work?
Are you done with your presentation, Anne? I didn't want.
Yes, I had understood that there would be a Q&A, and I just, I know that there's a little bit of time. I mean, I can continue to talk, but I wondered if anyone had any specific questions. I'll be glad to, entertain them.
Yes, we did have a Q&A section, but I wanted to wait until your presentation was over, unless there are specific questions to specific parts of your presentation that people want to ask. If not, I'll open the floor up right now for a Q&A session. If you have any questions for Anne, you can unmute yourself, or you can type your question in the chat, and myself or Pierre will read those out to Anne. I do have a question. I'll start. So Anne, what drove you to filmmaking, and why do these particular subject matters?
I started out actually, I guess in high school I was doing journalism, and then in college I studied photography actually, and then I came to filmmaking after that in search of a more collaborative kind of art form. But I don't know, I think that for me, sort of mainstream media, it's never been about just replicating what I saw. It's really been about trying to represent stories and people who I did not see, and I did not see in the mainstream. And so it was also to sort of reflect some of the experiences that I had, and through other people. I think that as a filmmaker, I really appreciate the process of filmmaking, since it allows me to keep learning as I engage with people. And so I think that, it's an incredibly challenging art form, since it requires so many resources, otherwise known as money. And but it also has the power to reach people, and so I think that's kind of how I came to this.
Thank you.
I know, Jorge, you had some questions. Did you? Oh, here, we've got a question here. Out of all the films you've created, which has been the biggest impact on me, has made the biggest impact on me? I don't know. I think, I don't know if it's the impact on me or the impact it has on others, right? What's more important? I think all of them have, represent a different chapter in my life. I think they're the same interests that have kind of evolved over time. And I feel like it's been, certainly this last film, Manzanar Diverted When Water Becomes Dust. It's probably the most ambitious film. We will probably be screening it on PBS in 2022, so you can look out for it there. If you miss it on the if you miss it in a film festival, but I think that it it's bringing together so much personal history, and it's really also, I think, brought together different parts of who I am in a very personal way, since it's being a Californian. I think that this history of Native American forced removal also, I think, is part of all of our history that maybe we are not so aware of. I mean, this story is the story everywhere in California, but I don't think it's really been taught in that way. I have my 10-year-old daughter right now in school. The curriculum is to look at, there's the section around, Native Americans, and then there's the section around sort of explorers and the missions. And I just, the way that it's taught, that narrative, I have such problems with. And so I realize that legacy still exists in the school. And I think that, I hope that, through this, we can continue to change our perspectives. Here's a question around identity. I guess I'm curious about which aspect of identity you're interested in, but I think for me, growing up in the U.S., I think that, this notion of ethnicity has always been such a huge part of how we are identified. And I have always pushed back on that. I feel like we are all so much more than that. There's class, there's gender, there's, sort of the communities that we grew up in, and I think that has been a big part of who I am. And so I feel like, I can relate and have connection to many different communities, even if I'm not African American. I mean, I grew up in an African American community. I feel very, I feel like I relate to those issues and that experience. My daughter, her father is from Guatemala, so that immigrant experience I can relate to. And yet, so much of the time, we are sort of pigeonholed by the way that we look. And so I think that I have really been trying to think about that in a bigger way. So somebody else was really idea of intersectionality is speaking on not fitting the part. Oh, okay, great. So
I have a question, Anne. So
yes.
In what ways does racial, ethnic, cultural, national differences play differently across the world versus how it plays out in the U.S.?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think that, I think that those things are really colored. I can't really speak about sort of generally. I can speak from my experiences of living in Japan, and I can speak from my experiences in Latin America, right? I think that in Japan, this experience of having other people part of the mix is relative well, I shouldn't say that it's new, since there is a Korean community in Japan, right? But the way that Koreans have been homogenized or forced to become part of the the general population is, still a big part of it. And I think that, so at an institutional level, because citizenship is not granted by birth in Japan, same way as in Germany, like that has a really big part of how people are able to buy into their citizenship, right? And so this is something that Japan has grappled with for a long time. And this really, from a kind of institutional perspective, really separates citizens and non-citizens from rights, right? For us, we, in the United States, we are born here, we can vote, and so then we have these different options, and we feel that we are empowered to exercise our voice. So I think in Japan, the way that people have been marginalized is different because at the institutional level, there isn't even a voice, right? But because the numbers of people, these communities are smaller, it also plays out differently. And I mean, I haven't lived in Japan recently, so I can't say how these communities that sort of came to Japan in the 90s, like how their children are assimilating. I know it's been, it's been rough for Korean Japanese to assimilate, and it's been a real fight to get recognition so that they can vote and that they can also use their own name, right? They were forced to adopt Japanese kanji in their names, so that they had to change their name. So this brought around this shame around who they were. So, I mean, I think a lot of these issues are similar, but they do play out kind of differently in different places. In Latin America, I will say, like, in terms of the hierarchy of race in Peru, I mean, I feel like, and this is probably true across Latin America, I think that the indigenous people are sort of even more marginalized. They're sort of at the bottom of the totem pole more so than, African Peruvians, Afro-Peruvians. So anyway, that's a complicated question, and I don't think I can quite answer it here, but I do feel like it does definitely play out differently.
That's okay. I'd like to echo your comment on the non-Japanese residents living in Japan having to adopt Japanese last names. I did hear about that. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the Japanese culture is always depicted, in media and in film as being very nice, very courteous, very friendly type of people. So it's interesting that topics such as race and you mentioned voting, the right to vote, play a significant factor in that culture.
Yeah, I don't know.
It wasn't more of a question. It was just more of a comment. I was kind of echoing your reply to the question. So I have a couple of more, but I think Lisa had a question here that I want to get in.
Please ask me, and ask me directly rather than me trying to read and extrapolate what your question is.
So Lisa.
Hi, Anne.
Hi.
Hi, Anne. My name is Lisa. I appreciated the comment in one of the clips where the young Japanese man in Peru, and there was the images and the signs were like, go back home. But, for most of us immigrants and, for the children of immigrants who are born then in the new country, when they say go back home, where is home? Because I'm speaking now for my son who's born in the US. He considers himself American. America is home. I think our younger generation or second, third generations, they struggle with that all the time, that identity. It's really it's interesting, as young immigrants, you want to, when you come, you want to do well and you want to look out for your family. You come because of the opportunities for your children, your family. And then, our children are going through, similar identity, not crisis, but, questioning as well. I remember that for myself personally. I'm Indian, but I was born and raised in Kenya. And I always thought that I'm Kenyan first. I never considered myself Indian first. And, and during difficult political times when, even though I was born there and was naturalized citizen, I was born after independence, they began to make it difficult in the 80s that no, one of your parents had to be born there for you to be considered a citizen. So, just all the stuff that's happening today in the world and all these discussions and conversations we're having has different, is bringing up different things for different people, and the impacts on our children and our families. It's just a comment. It's really interesting, all these triggers, and I also appreciated the clip on the Manzanar and the Tejon, and the land and the acknowledgement and everything. Thank you. I was just commenting. I mean, whatever input you want to share or anybody else, that's appreciated.
I really appreciate that. I mean, I think that, that question of belonging and that question of home, I mean, I feel like that dichotomy is really, it goes for anyone who leaves their homeland, right? And then it becomes complicated dependent on where they've adopted their home. I have a very close friend who's similar to you. Her family, she's a filmmaker also, but her family was in Kenya, but she's South Asian, and then the family went to the UK, and then she came here, and when she was in high school. So, I mean, I think she has many layers of what that home is. Obviously, she's been in the United States the longest, but, she also identifies as Kenyan. But, it's funny because when we made this, she was making this film in Afghanistan. And so I went with her to film there, and she would play her nationality depending on who she was speaking to, right? Because, at that time in Afghanistan, maybe being Indian wasn't so popular as being, is sort of saying you were Kenyan, and certainly being American was not a good thing. So she was able to sort of play this game, and then people looking at me, obviously, they would say to me, "Ni hao." I would be walking down the street in Kabul, and people would say "Ni hao," and she would look at me, and I was like, "Oh, this is the experience I've been having all of my life." In Los Angeles, people go "Chinita," and they're like, "But I'm not Chinese. I'm from," So it's curious, but I think that's what it enriches. I have learned to embrace that, right? Obviously, it's like this enriches our lives, but it also, I feel like we can't, I don't know, make excuses for those who also use this in a negative way to, minimize other people. I think it is very complex, and our world is very complex, especially with globalization. People move around all of the time, and so the fact that we all claim very, many different identities, we have many different connections to different communities, I don't think that can ever be underestimated. You can never judge a book by its cover. So
I have a comment. I agree. Like, if we were just born in a different time, this would be Mexico, or this would be
totally.
Before that, it was something else, And then also, I wanted to make a comment about what they would call you, Chinita.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's not calling you Chinese.